Hello. For tonight's Grizzly Tale, I'm going to read you a story from Grizzly Tales for Gruesome Kids. These are cautionary tales that I wrote for lovers of squeam. Tonight's story is called Goblin Mountain. Joseph Alexander lived in the shadow of an enormous mountain that towered over his parents' cottage. He had read many frightening stories about the mountain, about travellers who had climbed the craggy rock face never to be seen again, about the bands of fierce goblins that lived in the caves halfway up and dined on the flesh of little children, about the giant eagle that ruled its rocky domain from a nest perched high up in the clouds. Joseph treated the mountain with all the respect that these stories demanded. He never went near it. Yet in spite of his fear, he could not live so close to the mountain and not be fascinated by it. He would sit on the window ledge in his bedroom for hours on end, reading and rereading these gruesome tales. He was not a naughty child, but he was thoughtless. Whenever he had finished a story, he would tear the pages out of the book, open his window, throw the pages out, and watch them as they fluttered away across the garden towards the mountain. They looked so pretty, like large white butterflies. Joseph never once thought that what he was doing was wrong. Even when his father shouted at him for destroying something as precious as a book, he'd simply smile dreamily and say, "I thought I'd plant new books, Father, by scattering the pages across the mountainside." The day arrived when there was not a single book left in the house. Joseph had torn them all up and thrown them out of the window. His mother was in tears. His father stormed around downstairs, banging doors. "Now we have nothing to read, Joseph. Don't you see how wicked you have been?" wept his mother. "Go upstairs to the attic," ordered his father. "You will remain locked in there until you have learned to be sorry for what you have done." "What have I done?" said Joseph pathetically. "You have only lost forever stories that have been treasured for generations," shouted his father. "Now upstairs." The attic was very dark. The only light came from a tiny window high up in the roof, but it had never been opened, and a thick covering of dead leaves made a very effective curtain. Joseph shivered as he tried to make himself comfortable. It wasn't easy. The floor of the attic was covered in old nails and machine parts that his father had stored away, but had long since forgotten. That night, Joseph couldn't sleep. It wasn't the eerie screeching of the barn owl that kept him awake, but his own thoughts. A book was just bits of paper stuck together with glue. Didn't matter that he'd destroyed his parents' library. There were plenty of other books. They could buy some more. It didn't make sense to apologise. He didn't see why he should. Mind you, he didn't want to spend another night in the attic. If he could just open that window, he'd be able to escape across the roof. He scrabbled around in the half-light and found a dusty old trunk buried in a corner. It was just the right height for him to reach the window latch. He took hold of one of the handles and gave it an almighty tug. It didn't move. It was much too heavy. "There's probably a dead body inside," he joked with himself. Then he undid the lock and pushed the creaking lid open. There was no dead body. In fact, the trunk was empty, save for a large black book covered in cobwebs. He expected the book to be too heavy to lift, but when he took a firm grip of the cover, he discovered that it was as light as a feather. So why had the trunk been so heavy? The book was very old. On its cover it had a picture of a giant eagle perched on top of a mountain. Inside it was full of symbols and signs that meant nothing to Joseph. What he did recognise, however, were the pictures. Ugly faces, twisted bodies, evil eyes. The book was covered with pictures of goblins. Joseph was hooked. He had never seen a book like it. Each page wove its magic around him and forced him to read on. There were pictures of goblins changing into frogs, of goblins floating in mid-air, of goblins summoning the devil from cracks in the mountain face. In almost no time at all, Joseph had finished it. And even though he hadn't understood a single word, he was sure it was an ancient book of magic spells. It was also the largest book he had ever read. Each page was the size of a desktop. Well, you can guess what happened next. Driven by overwhelming temptation, Joseph tore every page out of its black leather binding. He dragged the empty trunk into position, climbed on top, and pushed the window till it opened. Then he threw the pages out, one by one. Joseph was spellbound as they floated away across the garden like a flock of beautiful white birds. But as the pages reached the mountain, they burst into flame, and out of each flame sprung a black crow that flew up into the clouds and was lost from sight. The spell was broken. Joseph was suddenly afraid. The cover of the book, which he was still holding, became hot, and the eyes of the giant eagle shone like two red coals in the darkness. With a scream, he hurled the cover out of the window and watched it spiral downwards into the branches of his mother's favourite apple tree. The tree burst into flames, and in a second was reduced to a black and charred stump. Sitting on top of the stump was a giant eagle. Joseph's mother heard his scream and came running. She took the stairs to the attic 3 at a time. She heard Joseph scream for a second time as she fumbled with the key in the lock. The lock turned, and she burst into the room only to be knocked backwards by a fierce gust of wind. A giant eagle's feather settled on the floor next to her, and she looked up just in time to see her son's legs disappearing through the window. The eagle wheeled round towards the mountain. Clasped in its talons was the tiny, helpless, whimpering figure of Joseph Alexander. The eagle seemed to lose interest in him as it circled its nest. It just let go, and Joseph fell like a stone. If it hadn't been for the trees stretching out their branches to catch him and let him down gently, he would surely have fallen to his death. "Beware," said a whispering voice in Joseph's ear. "Beware." He spun round to see who it was, but there was no one there. A tree, bent over by the wind, brushed Joseph's shoulder. "Beware," whispered the voice again. It was the tree talking. "Beware of what?" said Joseph. But the wind had stopped blowing, and the tree had straightened up. There was no reply. Joseph looked around him. He had landed on a ledge by the entrance to a vast cave. He crawled inside and huddled up against the wall for fear that the eagle might return for an early supper. The cave stank. It was the nauseating stench of rotten meat. Joseph wondered what type of beast could possibly live in such conditions. "Goblins? Surely not," he said to himself. "They only exist in storybooks. They aren't real." "Oh, yes, we are," said a rasping voice nearby. The goblin pushed his warty nose into Joseph's face and grasped Joseph's neck with his webbed fingers. "And now you're coming with me." Joseph was dragged through a maze of dripping wet stone passages by a chain that the goblin had fastened round his neck. In the distance, Joseph could hear voices chattering excitedly. As he approached them, the passage opened into a vast underground cavern. Black crows were perched all around the roof, and sitting against the walls were row upon row of stinking goblins. They leapt to their feet when he came in and jostled around him. Some poked him with sticks and pinched his legs. Others simply came too close and breathed their foul breath all over him. There were 3 loud knocks. A white-haired goblin had entered the chamber through a door at the back. He had a goatskin cloak around his shoulders and carried a thorny cudgel in his hand. "Let the trial commence!" he roared, and everyone took their seats again, leaving Joseph in the middle of the goblin court. "You are accused, Joseph Alexander, of willfully destroying the great Book of Tharg, containing the mystical ancient secrets of this magic mountain. Have you anything to say before I pass sentence?" "What about my trial?" shouted Joseph. "Aren't you going to listen to what I have to say in my defence?" "No," said the judge. "That is not the goblin way." A roar of approval came from the other goblins. "Chop his head off!" shouted one. "Bury him in a vat of goose fat!" shouted another. "But I didn't mean to do it," cried Joseph. "I promise I'll never do it again." "Too late," declared the judge. "You have torn up too many books for me to believe you. You're guilty." "No!" shouted Joseph. "Take him away and plant him with the others." A ripple of laughter went around the court. "What do you mean, plant me?" said Joseph, as 100 goblin fingers lifted him up. "You are to be turned into a tree," said the judge, "just like all the other children who think it is acceptable behaviour to tear up their books. Trees make paper, paper makes books. One day you will be chopped down to make paper. One day you will be stuck together to make a book. One day you will be torn to shreds by some other miserable child." There was a loud cheer. The white-haired goblin left the court, and Joseph was carried out onto the mountainside by the mob. They dug a deep hole and threw Joseph into it. He looked around despairingly at all the other trees, but they were powerless to help. Then he heard a familiar voice. "I warned you to beware," whispered the tree in his ear. It was one of the other children who had been planted alongside him. "But I didn't know," Joseph cried. "I didn't know! I didn't know!" "You didn't know what?" said his mother, who had finally managed to open the door to the attic. "What?" said Joseph, who didn't know where he was. "You've been screaming your head off for the last 10 minutes, she said. Joseph was still in the attic. The black crows, the giant eagle, the goblin court. It must all have been a dream. Joseph threw his arms around his mother. "I promise I'll never tear up another book in my whole life," he wept. "I don't want to be a tree." "Well, I'm sure you don't," said his mother, as she hugged him back. "Come on, it's time you went to bed." Then she picked Joseph up and carried him downstairs. In the attic, an icy wind gusted in through the open window, picked up the giant eagle's feather, and blew it out across the garden towards the mountain.